Okay.
Hi, everyone. We have another guest today. Thank you very much for your time and welcome to the show.
Hello, my name is Yuji Maeda, a research fellow at the Japanese National Defense Institute, National Institute for Defense Studies, actually, under the Defense Ministry of Japan, and specializing in U.S. China relations, security of the Asia-Pacific region, and specifically interested in Taiwan issue.
Good. Okay, so I would like to start with introducing our foreign audience who's not so familiar with Taiwan and Japan, that there is a long-standing, really very friendly and close relationship between two countries, which is even more surprising that Japan was a colonizer of Taiwan for half a century. And still, though both countries are on very good and friendly terms, basically all Taiwanese either have been to Japan or are going to visit Japan. Both countries help each other, let's say when there's an earthquake, now also in terms of security. So maybe you could tell us a little bit more about where the friendship comes from and how it translates, let's say, into now the political realm and security.
Okay, so as you suggested, there is a stark contrast between, among the former Japanese colonies, and the countries invaded by the Imperial Japan, China, South Korea, and Taiwan. And especially China and South Korea might still have some of the, anti-imperial Japanese sentiments, but Taiwanese do not have that kind of sentiments, at least not as strong as the other countries. The reason why lies in the post-war history, obviously, especially during the Cold War. Basically, Taiwan, ruled by the Nationalist Party and by the leadership of Chiang Kai-shek, was friendly, not allies to Japan directly, but they shared the same ally in the United States, and they also shared the same common threat in communist China. And Japan has been pretty forthcoming in assistance to Taiwan. There has been so much economic and technological exchange between the two countries, culturally, economically, politically. There is so much interaction between the two countries, not at the government level, but also at the level of the citizens as well. So that Taiwanese people feel friendly to Japanese, as well as Japanese feeling friendly to Taiwan as well. So that nowadays the Japanese people feel very sympathetic to Taiwan being threatened by China, so that the feelings are mutual.
Japan faces much more incursions, because everybody talks in the West about the PLA incursions into Taiwan's ADIS. But actually, as you say, if you look at the numbers, in case of Taiwan, it was like 300 last year. In case of Japan, it was 1,000. So you're telling us that it's both China and Russia and North Korea. Could you please elaborate on this?
So yes, China is trying to gauge the level of resolve and commitment with its neighbors. So they, of course, are incurring into Taiwanese airspace as well, but they do also the same thing to Japan as well. And that's because I suppose China and Russia and North Korea, all of these potential threats, have difficulty gauging the Japanese commitment to the Taiwan issue, because the Japanese themselves don't really know what their mind is, really, themselves. So, the problem is doubly difficult for China. So they are trying to gauge the Japanese resolve by sending some military aircraft into Japanese airspace and witnessing what kind of response Japan might make, because if Taiwan contingency happens, then Japan is in a very difficult situation. So the U.S. bases, large bases, exist in Okinawa. So what the U.S. might do, and if the U.S. decides to intervene, then they might have to, well, I would say they will definitely have to use the bases in Japan, so that Japan is kind of automatically involved in a crisis, very much likely, so that China is trying to gauge the level of resolve, not by Taiwan, not just by the U.S., but also that of Japan.
And it's also the Russian forces, yes? Do they also incur into the Japanese space, or is it not only the Chinese? It's also the Russians, yes?
Yeah, Russians do that all the time, and I believe Russia's core strategic interest lies in the West, that has been the same through the Soviet era as well as the current Russia. They care a lot about Ukraine, obviously, and the Western Heartland, and they do care about the Far Eastern region, but that is because Russia is even more insecure in the Far East, because the balance of the correlation of forces is not exactly favorable to them, because it's it's just so much farther away from the Russian heartland, so that Russia has such a long territorial borders with China, so they feel threatened by China. And also Japan is home to many U.S. forces as well, and they kind of imagine that Japan is a puppet of the U.S. empire, so that they fear Japanese incursions into Russia, perhaps as well. So that they are trying to gauge what Japan might be contemplating as well. So they, invade our airspace as well.
Japan's military is arming bases closer to Taiwan on the Yonaguni Island, and they also place their air defense missile units. And this will be now the first time that there will be a combat unit deployed there. Also, an electronic warfare unit will be established, and the number of personnel will increase on Yonaguni from 170 to 210 soldiers. So that I think is also refers to what we discussed before, the closer cooperation between Taiwan and Japan, also reaction to China, which must anger them probably a lot. Do you think that trend will somehow continue, and the cooperation between Taiwan and Japan might be more formal or closer in this regard?
Yes, I absolutely believe that this trend will continue in one way or another. I cannot say for sure that the relationship, the defense cooperation between the Taiwanese and the Japanese will get formal, in the sense that the Japan recognizes Taiwan as an independent state and that kind of thing. I cannot say that. But I believe that the defense cooperation will proceed basically in unofficial basis. And even without direct cooperation with the Taiwanese forces, Japan would continue investing in its southwestern region, Okinawa and the Yonaguni Islands, because there is a fundamental shift in threat perception among the Japanese. Traditionally, during the Cold War, for example, the Japanese ground self-defense forces were pretty much focused on Hokkaido, thinking about the possible Soviet invasion into Hokkaido. But now it's all China. It's China, not Russia. It's China, obviously. So that even the ground self-defense forces is shifting its forces and has established the fast amphibious operations units as well. They are deployed to Kyushu, pretty close to the possible contingency area, and the naval and air self-defense forces are shifting its focus to southwestern region. And what is difficult is that the southwestern region is just dozens, if not hundreds of small islands. So just the situational awareness is a pretty big challenge. So deploying these intelligence units on Yonaguni Islands and establishing some big radar sites is a first step to increase our situational awareness around Taiwan if things go wrong.
One more development. One of my previous guests, Grant Newsham, he wrote an article recently where he discussed the Marine Littoral Regiment, newly established between the U.S. and Japan. He called it, I quote, one of the most significant advances in the U.S. force posture in the region in the last at least a decade, unquote, on the Nansei, Shoto, and Ryukyus. Could you also talk about this? Because he described it at length as really a huge step forward in terms of bringing both Japanese and the U.S. forces together and their cooperation.
Yes, I would agree with that point of view. This is a very big departure from the traditional U.S.-Japanese alliance framework. So the traditional framework has been that the U.S. provide the offensive force. For example, in the case China takes control of some islands, then the U.S. force Marines would take back the islands, and the Japanese self-defense forces would focus on exclusively defense operations. But amphibious operations units are essentially offensive, at least tactically, if not strategically, so that the joint U.S.-Japanese amphibious forces would be a big step forward to show to the potential threats, that we have the capability to reverse what you might hope to achieve when it comes to Taiwan or Okinawa or Yonaguni Islands. We can take back whatever you take.
Yeah, and also what's important is another of my guests, a Rear Admiral who I had here on the show. He said that there is almost a perfect cooperation between the US and British forces, a close one between US and Australian. But I think the US wants to have also very close cooperation, that the forces basically operate as one unit. I think that that's the tendency now with Japan, that they have such a good cooperation and so much practice that it's almost like one army in some time.
Right. So in this case, the interests between the US and Japan align, right? So Japan, from the Japanese perspective, so Japan has some reasons to fear the potential abandonment by the United States, especially when it comes to places like the Senkaku Islands, which is de facto disputed between Japan and China. And China might think that there might be a discrepancy in interest between Japan and the United States, because the United States, in the end of the day, they do not care too much about those rocks of the sea, but Japan cares a lot about those rocks. So China might perceive that discrepancy, and what Japan is trying to do is that this Senkakus on all of these islands are definitely under Article 5 of the U.S.-Japan Security Treaty, and we. Japan and the United States together defend this country, these islands jointly. And the United States also has interest in showing this kind of resolve because the United States heartland is just so far away from the possible contingency area in the Western Pacific. So that for the United States, it's absolutely essential to cooperate with its allies, such as Japan and Taiwan, to play an effective role in a military operation.
I would like to ask about purely now Japan, those recent increases in Japan's national defense spending. How does the government deal with the society, with its populace? How do they discuss it internally? How does the discussion go? Because, of course, on one hand, they tax their citizens, which makes no one happy. But on the other hand, how much aware are the Japanese of the threat and ready to pay some additional money for the security they need?
Yeah, that's a great point, because there's a real dilemma among the government and among the Japanese people. So at least for the past 10, 15 years, the Japanese people have been genuinely worried about the possible Chinese threat and possible North Korean threat, so that they have been pushing for Japan to increase this defense budget, possibly. But the moment the tax increase is kind of floated into the discussion, they kind of turn against it. The whole idea, because the Japanese economy is not exactly in an excellent shape right now, if not in the last 30 years, so that the public opinion is pretty split about it. But in my opinion, the fundamental question is not whether they support defense budget increase, but how we do it. So they oppose tax increase, but they do advocate defense budget increase, because they understand it is absolutely necessary to catch up with the increasing Chinese defense budget and the potential threats from somewhere else. So that in the end, the question is how the government can skillfully convince the people that how essential this is, and also how to make this tax increase appear fair, in a sense that the government absolutely is doing best to minimize and save the money somewhere else, just reducing unnecessary spending somewhere else and using all the tax money effectively.
Another issue that I think also comes up in the discussion in Japan is China's influence. I can imagine that they unofficially try to influence the domestic discussion with regard to domestic politics. For example, the U.S. bases in Japan and the independence movements on Japanese islands. What do you know? How strong does China gets involved into the internal politics in Japan? Do they support some movements? Is there any let's say, unofficial cooperation between those movements and the Chinese?
So yes, before talking about Japan, talking about Taiwan, there's a pretty famous Chinese attempt, such as the United Front movement, to instigate the Taiwanese movement to cooperate with China and to be more forthcoming with Chinese, the mainland China. By contrast, when it comes to Japan, I imagine that China would be very much interested in instigating, for example, independence movement in Okinawa and such, because the people in Okinawa are kind of frustrated with the Japanese government because of the large U.S. bases so much concentrated in Okinawa rather than the Japanese homeland, so that the Okinawa people have some legitimate resentment against Japanese homeland. But at the same time, I have no direct evidence to show that the China is really doing this kind of work. So being a scholar, I have to be skeptical about this possibility right now.
Good. One last topic I wanted to discuss is Japan's growing military cooperation, and I would like to address first the regional one. And they have agreements with, for example, recently with Philippines, which allow them to join humanitarian exercises in the Philippines. Also, the Filipinos gave them, the Americans, access to more, to form new military bases in the Philippines. So how is the regional cooperation of Japan? I know that they also cooperate in terms of technology with India, with the Philippines, with other countries. So I think it's definitely growing, right?
Right. So Southeast Asia is another arena of influence operations, so to speak, between China and the United States, or between blue team and the red team, if you like. And the Philippines is one of the crucial battlefields in Southeast Asia because it's located in a geographical pivot point, I would say. So if you have access to the Subic Bay military base, then that would be a huge advantage for the U.S. power projection capabilities. And how Japan comes into play is an interesting question. As you imply, the Japanese government has been trying to provide some capacity building assistance to Philippines, for example, providing some coastal defense ships to Philippines and stuff like that. But it has been not enough compared to the level of threat the Philippines face compared to the very much armed Chinese Coast Guard.
If I may interrupt, I think the same thing is going on with Vietnam, right? The Japanese they support Vietnamese forces in the same way with ships and boats and some equipment, right?
Right. Yes. And Vietnam has been, just like Taiwan, Vietnam is very much pro-Japanese, very friendly to Japan. And also and also Vietnam has a long history of being a battlefield of great power conflict. They have fought a war against the United States, though they have fought against China for millennia, more than a millennia, I would say. So that, like, the Vietnamese at the base, they have a very realist view of international politics. So they might have a historical grudge even against the United States. However, by the logic of power politics, the Vietnamese recognize the need to cooperate with the US as well as with Japan, so that they would be even more forthcoming than Philippines to cooperate with Japan and the United States, I would argue.
And then there is also the cooperation with India, not so much in terms maybe militarily, but technologically. And that's good because one neighbor, I mean, both are US allies, but one is in the north of China, one in the south, and them cooperating together puts China probably in a tight spot, in a tight place. So I think all these developments are, are going in the right direction in terms of Asia's security.
Yes, I would say the trends are pretty good so far. The difficult question about the Quad framework is that India is located on the other body of water, which is Indian Ocean, that is separate from the East China Sea and the South China Sea. And we should not be having our hopes high to involve India into a military alliance, just like the alliance between Japan and the United States. But as you have implied, we do share some long-term strategic competition interests to contain the rise of China and direct military threats with China, because India, for its part, has its border conflicts with China itself, so that India is not exactly friendly to China. But at the same time, India also has some extensive economic relations with China, so that India wouldn't be happy to just go all in and ally with the United States and Japan to counter China. I imagine that the Indians would be interested in keeping healthy economic relations with China and also strategically balancing against it. So the challenge is that in what areas, economic and technological, in what kind of concrete cooperation we can develop with India.
So if we would summarize the discussion today, then what do you think are the chances that China might also maybe attack Japan one day? Because when we see the recent developments, for example, the aircraft carrier visited in December, areas around Taiwan, around Japan, and even went as far as to close to Guam, and this was interpreted as Chinese forces showing the readiness or preparedness to both attack Taiwan, Japan, and also threaten the U.S. Is there a possibility that China would also be preparing for an attack or response to Japan?
Yes, I would suggest it's a real possibility. I wouldn't say it's probable, but it is possible. And the aircraft carriers are quite essential power projection weapons. They are not weapons designed to just defend yourself. They are just designed to go out in a long distance and project military power, so that probably the number one enemy in the Chinese minds is the United States Navy, obviously, because the distant blockade by the U.S. Navy would be crushing to the Chinese economy, so that the China has to find some ways to break out of this potential blockade and secure sea lines of communication for the Chinese economy. But at the same time, Japan is also another obstacle if China wants to achieve its strategic aims, because, as I said, when it comes to Taiwan contingency, Japan is an important factor, partly because of Japan's own strategic interests to keep Taiwan independent, but also Japan is a catalyst for the U.S. power projection capability in the region. So that if Japan refuses to cooperate with the United States, then the United States would be having a difficult time to mount an effective military operation in the area. So that China, if they calculate that Japan would be involved in this kind of military conflict, then it might be rational for them to mount a fast strike, maybe the massive missile salvo up front in the U.S. bases in Japan, such as in Okinawa. And if they do that, Japan would definitely be involved in this conflict. So that's the kind of possibility we have to be prepared.
Great. Thank you very much for your time. It was really interesting.
Thank you so much.